We are, Ruth.
So please, Rebecca.
Thank you very much, Shlomo. I'm going to show a PowerPoint, so while that's getting set up, I'd like also to extend my gratitude and thanks to INSS and particularly Emily, and also to Camille and FRS for holding what I think is a very timely conference on this subject, and also for inviting me to participate. And so I'm going to take my brief, I'm going to look back, I'm going to look at some recent developments, and I'm going to look forward. And the first thing that I need to say is that the NAM is a bit of an oxymoron. It's not a movement. It's certainly not unified. And in the post-Cold War era, it's not non-aligned, or at least what's it meant to be non-aligned with, or in distinction from. It is itself, the NAM has some, 110 plus states. There are more than 30 in the Conference on Disarmament, although that's still called the G21, I think it's still called that. And they have as many divisions between them as does the Western group, probably more in fact, in real terms, in terms of their interests. And similarly, the concept of non-nuclear weapon states is also a slightly strange one, because of course it's a definition under the NPT, but under non-nuclear weapon states there are members of nuclear alliances that still rely on nuclear-dependent deterrence policies through NATO, Japan, Australia, South Korea, so on. There are nuclear-free states, ones that are within nuclear weapon-free zones, which covers the entire southern hemisphere and a few spots in the north. And then there are the ones that aren't quite either of those two areas. And again, what you actually see is some very significant differences of interest depending on geostrategic positioning and regions and things. The NAM has India and Pakistan as nuclear armed states within it. So, you have these kinds of contradictions. So I wanted to start with that kind of a caveat, and then move on just to reminding us of what the 2010 Review Conference achieved, at least on paper. And it was a final document with 64 action points that had been negotiated and agreed by consensus. And then a compilation of issues, not negotiated, but, well, they were actually negotiated in the various main committees, but they were not in the final, they were not finally absolutely agreed on. There was no consensus required for that, so that was done under the chair's own kind of assessment or recognizance, but actually a lot of that had been negotiated, and in many ways makes for much more interesting reading about what were the dynamics in the 2010 Review Conference than is demonstrated by these rather lowest common denominator, in many cases, action points. And I think we have to be truthful that in terms of the politics of the 2010 Review Conference, the proposal that it had various mothers and fathers from civil society, from Russia, as well as, of course, from the League of Arab States, for a conference on the 1995, on implementing the 1995 resolution on the Middle East, the WMD free zone resolution. That was the key issue that once, without that there would certainly have not been consensus. With it, there turned out to be just enough leverage, chiefly in fact by NAM colleagues of Iran, to ensure that Iran had to kind of pull back from the strategy that we understand they had pretty much had, which was of holding out against there being an agreement, particularly if there was any language that was critical of Iran. Now, there is language in the first part that is not agreed, but there, of course, isn't in any of the consensus parts of the document. I put this one up. I think we really dealt with this yesterday, and I just wanted to make sure that it wasn't, in the later comments that I talk about some of the reframing in the NPT, that it doesn't come back to me of, oh, well, but what about North Korea, Iran, etc. So let's be very clear. Most, if not all, of the NAM and the non-nuclear weapon states were equally, they may have been pushing for disarmament and the Middle East resolution conference, 2012 conference, but many of them were also concerned by other aspects of the NPT that it failed to tackle, that it failed to be able to address. And these are some of the ones that we discussed yesterday. So now, this is not saying anything that anyone, I think, would not have already known. Much was riding on the 2012 conference for the Arab League and the NAM. Egypt was at that time, of course, head of the NAM. Egypt always is the key mover within the Arab League, even if it's not officially the coordinator, which of course rotates. And this was one that they had started working on really since the 2005 NPT review conference, when Egypt was kind of left with quite a lot of political egg on its face for the way it had kind of mismanaged trying to get through some of its objectives. So it was determined this time that it was going to address this issue in as practical a way as it could, in a means that could be delivered by the NPT review conference, but also that would, in a sense, reach out to Israel by going beyond, which is why it was so important that the conference was to be convened by the UN Secretary General with the assistance of the depository states of the NPT, and obviously then the facilitator, who subsequently was appointed as Jaakko Laajava of Finland, to make this happen. And it's important to recognize the facilitator was not only supposed to facilitate, communicate, consult, to get the 2012 conference to convene, but also any follow-up from that conference and to bring that to the 2015 review conference. So these are the kind of hinging. So my questions, and it's as much a question for you really as an analysis or answer, is what are the implications if this hasn't taken place in 2012? Clearly it hasn't. Is it dead? Now that the spotlight's off, is it now actually more possible for there to be some behind-the-scenes interaction to see what can be done on this issue? But what happens if it doesn't get held before 2015? These were some of the responses that I heard from particularly some of the NAM, some of the Middle East countries. Was the kind of, well, what did we expect? We tried to make the NPT work on this issue. This was an incredibly important issue in 1995 in getting consensus for the indefinite extension of the NPT, but since then the ball has been dropped. It was not so different from in 2000. A huge amount of political attention and political capital was expended on getting the 13 steps on nuclear disarmament that the New Agenda Coalition negotiated on behalf of the non-nuclear countries with the P5, and then barely was the ink dry when some of the P5 were reneging on it. So there was that sort of sense of, the cynicism and also the anger. We were conned. Although I have to say there was more cynicism than anger. And my question again is, is this just optics? The NPT seems to go through this, and yet it still has these paper exercises every 5 years, and it seems to be able to weather failing at least once every 5 years. It can't fail twice in a row without that really being considered to be bad. But is that going to be good enough? And really so I think there are deeper consequences for the regime. And I think there's been a certain amount of complacency because it keeps weathering these kinds of, you have this, huge effort to get some kind of agreement, and then nothing happens on actually implementing that agreement. But I think now bubbling underneath, and by a kind of coalition of non-nuclear countries that includes NAM but is not driven by the NAM, I think there's now a different kind of emphasis, and it's increasingly on accelerating nuclear disarmament, and not, lest I be accused of not being realistic in these things, it's not because nuclear disarmament is, some kind of idealistic objective, that it's some kind of sort of dream or sort of paper objective. It's actually because a lot of these states are increasingly seeing that nuclear disarmament is fundamental to the sustainability of non-proliferation. It's fundamental to the sustainability of nuclear security, whatever that quite means. It's fundamental, in fact, to the health and security of a number of key regions and also the world. So the focus is, so those states did not want to renegotiate the 13 steps. They saw quite rightly that any renegotiation would be a rollback, and indeed that's what happened. They focused, and I think the P5 were caught hopping, they didn't quite see this until quite late in the day, on framing a different context, an approach for nuclear disarmament, particularly within the context of humanitarian consequences, also references to international law and international humanitarian law, and here was the direct quote from, in fact, the consensus part of the final document. Now, why was this important? Well, because when countries have put forward the notion of a ban on nuclear weapons, or a nuclear weapon convention, or a treaty to ban the use, deployment, production, etc. of nuclear weapons, they've often been told that it would undermine the NPT, or either that it's premature or that it would undermine the NPT. And that's been the kind of mantra of the nuclear armed states and some of their allies for a very long time. So by putting these kinds of references actually into the NPT, they did this this was a strategically deliberate act on behalf of some key non-nuclear countries. And it was in order to make that bridge. Because 45 years after 1968, and indeed 20 years after the Cold War ended, for there still to be 19,000 nuclear weapons in the arsenals, and for there now to be 9 nuclear-armed states, whether or not they are NPT declared or not, is a serious problem for those states that are still holding to not having nuclear weapons, that are not going down the road for whether whether it's perceived as a security decision or essentially a strategic political decision of acquiring these weapons that still seem to have quite considerable levels of value attached to them, at least by some states. So it's not premature in their view, and it no more undermines the NPT in their arguments than the CTBT could be considered as undermining the Partial Test Ban Treaty. The PTBT, as we heard from Rose, 1963, and the 1968 NPT, these were instruments brought about, or at least accelerated, through the shock of the Cuban Missile Crisis, but they were partial. China and France never joined the Partial Test Ban Treaty at all, and only actually joined the NPT in 1992 in order to join in on the 1995 Review and Extension Conference and be part of that decision on indefinite extension. So the CTBT remained the goal, just as, in fact, in the NPT, in its preamble in Article 6, and also in its original framing, if you look back at the original negotiations on the NPT, it was always meant to be a stepping stone towards the total abolition, banning, elimination of nuclear weapons. So since 2010, the group of countries that were particularly active, many below the level of radar, together with ICANN as the main kind of framing NGO at the 2010 review conference, which took a lot of NGOs by surprise, as a matter of fact, because they hadn't seen that coming. These have been putting in place some of the stepping stones for the new approach that was sort of embedded in the framing of the final document of the NPT. First of all, there was the Red Cross resolution on working towards the elimination of nuclear weapons. The most important thing, or two important things about this. One is the Red Cross has not dealt with the nuclear weapons issue since 1982. Since 1982, the height of the Cold War, when there were all the demonstrations throughout Europe about new generations of nuclear weapons. And Jakob Kellenberger laid the groundwork for this by giving a very important speech just before the NPT to the Geneva diplomatic community, where he really went into a lot of detail about the catastrophic humanitarian consequences if nuclear weapons were used at all, and also that the Red Cross and none of the humanitarian assistance and aid organisations would be able to cope. That it was nonsense to try to rely on the management of the consequences. And this resolution referred to ensuring that nuclear weapons are never used again, and also, very significantly, talked about the pursue with good faith, we all know that language from Article 6 of the NPT, and conclude with urgency and determination negotiations to prohibit the use of and completely eliminate nuclear weapons through a legally binding international agreement, i.e. a treaty of some kind. The second the thing that followed on was last May in Vienna at the 2012 NPT PrepCom. There was a Swiss-led statement with 16 countries calling for the humanitarian consequences or the humanitarian dimension of nuclear disarmament. And this slide shows the first 16 of those countries, and actually 2 NATO countries there, Norway and Denmark, for example, and a kind of cross-section, some from the New Agenda Coalition, but some who were not in that. Note Egypt is there. Then that by 2012, October, the statement was joined by 35 countries altogether, again quite a cross-section, and this time put into the UN First Committee. And a lot of countries wanted to be signing on to it, interestingly, but it was not open for negotiation as a text. That was not what they... But again, part of it is optics, a lot of it is political strategy. It's not just an initiative going through the NPT process, this is an initiative also going through the UN and the UN process. And then the final point here, and so this, the states, the end are the states that were added. So altogether on that page you can see all 35 of them. And then there is this Norwegian government initiative to hold, a conference. It's going to be taking place very shortly, March 4th to 5th. I don't know. I know that Israel will have received an invitation to this conference. All governments were invited by the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Norway, and we know that at least there's more than 100 have so far definitely confirmed their attendance, and that some of the nuclear-armed states are among that 100, but not yet all. ICANN will be holding a civil society forum a few days before. But this is another very interesting initiative. So what we're seeing here is, from the NPT 2010 really to the UN First Committee now, we're seeing humanitarian approaches gathering momentum. They're not being fobbed off by being told they're premature or that they would undermine the NPT. In fact, they're being presented as the fulfillment of the core objectives of the NPT in ways that the NPT, as we were all discussing yesterday, isn't equipped to fulfill. The 3.5, 4 countries outside the NPT are not going to join as non-nuclear weapon states under current conditions, and it's impossible to open the definition for them to join as nuclear weapon states. There's problems there, and the instruments attached to the NPT now are less and less effective. So the growing frustration, and again we talked about this yesterday, so I'm not going to spend much time on why it is but the NPT regime is seen as not meeting the longer-term interests, particularly of the countries that don't have nuclear weapons, or the countries with the nuclear alliances that actually want the alliances to get rid of nuclear weapons. When we think about the stakeholders, the NPT stakeholders were defined in the treaty, but what's actually reframing the regime is a different set of stakeholders. It's nuclear-free, however that's understood, and nuclear-dependent states. All the nuclear-armed states, whether in the NPT or not, are seen as nuclear-dependent. And that human rights with global security and environmental sustainability are being prioritised over the nuclear establishment interests and the power projection, strategic kind of interests associated with the possession and indeed the proliferation of nuclear weapons. So there are now advocacy partnerships. This one I just threw threw in because on the first day there was some talk, particularly looking historically, but there was some talk about kind of what Israel derives from its policy of nuclear opacity or ambiguity. And I just, wanted also to use these quotes. These are real problems, to present nuclear weapons in this deterrent or freedom of act or comfort blanket way acts actually as a kind of proliferation driver, or at least it undermines efforts to stem proliferation. You get the waltz, well, if that's what nuclear weapons do, then they should do it for everyone, shouldn't they, surely? And that's something I think most of us would not be happy with, a world with a lot of nuclear-armed states, because we basically know that nuclear deterrence is not an attribute of the nuclear weapons, it's a relationship between nuclear adversaries. It relies on communication, on trust, on understanding what your adversaries might hold as of sufficient value that if you threaten it, they would be deterred. So I have some post-2010 questions about the current NPT and the nuclear arms control. This is, I think, increasingly being talked about, of whether, in fact, these are part of the problem and can't become part of the solution. Are they in the way now? And again, the partial test, nobody's saying that the NPT or nuclear arms control should be ignored or swept aside, but it's whether they need to be moved beyond. And again, absolutely stress that, when the CTBT was being negotiated, nobody suggested ditching the partial test ban treaty. The partial test ban treaty stayed as a very important kind of benchmark, a normative and legal requirement, but the new treaties were put in to take over some of the weaknesses, to overcome the weaknesses of the treaties. I question the nuclear security, the notion of nuclear security that's been promulgated that's really pitched at nuclear terrorism. It's pitched at, crime, black market, nuclear proliferation, black markets, Walmarts and so on. But could we actually achieve something such as nuclear security? And also, really, the question, the tools, the approaches, and the institutions of the current regime. And then ask for thought experiment on what would a process of disarmament and what would the political institutional tools that such a process might give us look like if, instead of trying to do this in a situation where countries like Israel, the US, Russia, etc., well, not the US actually, increasingly not the US, it's sort of, Israel, yes, Russia, yes, to some extent Britain and France, less and less India. I just came back from India. It's kind of interesting. They're in a bit of a debate on this. But that gives this incredibly high value, whether, it's weak and declining states that seem to get the high value attached to nuclear weapons as part of their doctrine. If we reduce that value, if we reduce the legitimacy of nuclear doctrines based on use, threatened use, or even retaliatory use, what would a process of disarmament and what kind of tools could we then be able to develop that we can't do now? And then the final few, and I'm really going to whiz through these because for those of you that got this report, they're in the back of my essay, which is the first of the essays there. And this was, again, a thought experiment, looking on the one hand at the arms control and non-proliferation processes, and at the other hand at what, the different way of looking through disarmament. So finally, the key non-nuclear countries are framing a new security mindset, and it's based on delegitimizing nuclear weapons for everyone. And it's based very much on this inhumane, unacceptable harm kind of portrayal. It's possible now because international humanitarian law has begun to develop those kinds of things. It's been tested out with the landmines and the cluster munitions treaty. Nobody is saying that this treaty would be the end product. Nobody is saying that it would solve all the problems in one go. It's seen as the next step in order to move towards the elimination of nuclear weapons, rather than the final step once elimination is practically achieved. So it's wanting to change the game and the rules and the terms within which the non-nuclear, the good guys, if you like, the non-nuclear countries are in fact rendered powerless. they're rendered passive under this regime, and they want to have a little bit more power in determining what their security is about. So it's about relearning the catastrophic humanitarian consequences. Again, I don't have time to go into that. And, lest I not be called a realist, multiple factors actually contribute to interest-based decisions. Here we have Gorbachev that recognizes the peace movement, the mobilization of civil society throughout Europe was a factor. So was the scientists that talked about nuclear winter. And, of course, so were the progressives in the Reagan administration in making it possible for them to meet in Reykjavik. And I guess this one is just to say, it really is possible, because that silo that you see women protesters dancing on New Year's Day of 1983 at the height, or perhaps we should say the depth, of the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union looks like this one now. The base is gone. The silo has to stay there for verification purposes, but that's a herd of very rare Exmoor ponies and people taking their dogs for walks. So can I paraphrase perhaps Rose's quote from President Johnson? Nuclear disarmament need not be impracticable, and proliferation and the use of nuclear weapons need not be inevitable. Thank you very much.